The following program contains mature subject matter, coarse language, and content that some viewers may find offensive or disturbing. Content includes descriptions of child abuse, suicide, and murder. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello, and welcome to Cunt News. I'm Timothy Cockwallet, and this is our last episode, as you can tell by the immediate elimination of my cheesy anchor voice, and the fact that I will be reading actual pieces of paper. There may even be an edit or two. Today is Canada Day, which is appropriate because this entire episode is going to focus mostly on one Canadian cunt in particular. Several adjacent ones were involved in the actions taking place today, but we're going to focus on him and the results of his actions. So strap in, because I'm going to try and cover a lot in a short period of time, and maybe manage to do some jokes, but honestly, we'll probably just end up making everyone sad and uncomfortable about the long, sordid history of our country. Again, happy Canada Day. And now, without further ado, the cunt we're looking at today is the first Prime Minister of Canada and winner of the proboscis monkey look-alike contest, Sir John A. MacDonald. Sir Jonathan was a real piece of shit. A statement that will have nationalists quivering in their boots between their usual sessions of gagging on them. But by the end of this, some of you may change your mind about the man who adorns our $10 bills. There's a long list of shit he did, and honestly we won't be able to get into the full detail of all of it, but we're going to try our best. So let's begin. First on the list we have the Chinese head tax. The Chinese head tax started in 1885, whereby after the completion of the Canadian Pacific Railway, a tax was levied on all Chinese immigrants who wanted to enter Canada. The Chinese immigrants already present were one of the primary workforces of the Canadian Pacific Railway, with around 15,000 to 20,000 Chinese laborers helping to build it, all for absolutely shit pay, even by 1880s standards. Chinese workers were paid $1 a day, and from this dollar they had to pay for their food and gear. White workers were also paid shittily between $1.50 to $2.50 per day, dollar obviously, but they did not have to pay for provisions. Chinese workers also had the most difficult and dangerous work, including tunneling and the use of explosives, which added to the many deaths. By some evidence, both in the US and Canada, Chinese immigrants made up the majority of the workforce because white people were too chicken shit to do it. An article I found claimed that estimates suggest that one worker for every mile of track that lay through the Rocky Mountains between Calgary and Vancouver died due to the dangerous conditions. Now, after some converting to kilometers, because, we're civilized people, that calculates to 603 deaths. So, despite their willingness to do work that white people weren't willing to do, for putting their blood, sweat, and tears into the foundations of a still functioning railway system that connected all of Canada together, all at the whims of rich businessmen, of whom Sir John A. was pretty close with, our dear and beloved first Prime Minister decided to thank them for their work by helping to create an act that taxed anyone of Chinese descent who wanted to immigrate here. Dick move, Johnny boy. Oh, sorry, Sir Johnny boy. Oh, and don't worry, we eventually stopped that tax and, well, let's see. There was the 1902 Royal Commission on Chinese and Japanese Immigration that reported that Chinese are unfit for full citizenship. That included the quote, "They are so nearly allied to a servile class that they are obnoxious to a free community and dangerous to the state." Yeah, because it's not like the Chinese had what would be constituted as a civilization for thousands of years in comparison to our 35 years at the time. So that was 1902, so... Oh, look! We fixed it in 1923. The tax was abolished by the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, which also outright prevented all Chinese immigration, except for that of business people, educators, clergy, students, and some others. Wait, so when did we allow immigration. Here it is. The Canadian Parliament repealed the Chinese Immigration Act on 14th May 1947. So 47 is 3 plus 50 plus 20 plus 1. 74 years ago. Well, fuck. Well, it's not like things are still shit nowadays, right? That's depressing. Well, we gotta move on to the next bit. Where were we? Oh yes, Sir Johnny Apple racist. So in addition to the Chinese head tax, what else did he do? Anything about racism against black people? Oh, here's some. Okay, so despite the death penalty having not been enforced since the early 1840s, Mackie D kept the death penalty around and justified the retaining of it as a penalty for rape. Now, at first you might think, oh cool, he just wanted the death penalty for rapists. What a defense against rape culture. Well, no. Historian Constance Backhouse, who has written about MacDonald, cited a letter to the Chief Justice of Nova Scotia, where MacDonald stated that it was expedient to keep it on the books, principally on account of the influx of blackguards of all kinds from the United States, and on account of the frequency of rape committed by Negroes, of whom we have too many here in Upper Canada. They are very prone to felonious assaults on white women. Well, what old-timey, not at all still held to this day by twat-waffles sentiments that have totally disappeared. So yeah, not a great reason. And of course, no discussion of the man that is Sir Johnny Cuntface MacDickenshire is complete without his treatment of the Indigenous people. Now, unfortunately, there is a mountain-sized shit pile to sift through, so we are going to leave a ton of stuff out, like his involvement in the Northwest Rebellion that involved the execution of Louis Riel, which was when a group of Métis, who were widely referred to colloquially as half-breeds, including in legal legislature, up until the 1930s. Fuckity fuck. Anyway, a group of Métis rose up against perceived injustices by the Canadian government and, well, their leader was executed. And that did not help foster good relationships or peaceful happenings for anyone involved. But the main thing Sir Johnny B. Good-for-Nothing did was help form the Indian Act, an act with a not very PC name that still exists to this day. Its influence is still dictating the lives of the Indigenous peoples, with two main points of interest in the Act being about who is allowed to identify as an Indian, the legal term they use, and how reservations are allowed to be run. Essentially, imagine if I kicked in the door of your house, took over your living room, and forced you to only be able to live in your water closet, and I decide whether you get to use the sink or not. Based on the drinking water situation for many Indigenous peoples to this day, you probably shouldn't trust the sink anyway, though, because I probably did stuff to it. Oh, and you only get the right to identify yourself the way you like based on whether I agree that you fit that criteria. Sound fun? Guess what? It wouldn't be, and it isn't. But of course, the main thing we're going to focus on that was written into the Indian Act was the implementation and forced attendance of residential schools. Here's a quote from Sir Johnny Shitstain MacDonald, then Prime Minister, from an official report of the debates of the House of Commons of the Dominion of Canada, 9th May 1883. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of the department that the Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. The phrase most often attributed to industrial schools, called residential schools here in Canada because, again, we like to pretend we're so much nicer than Americans, but really we're just quieter about our atrocities, was kill the Indian, save the man. Essentially, if you picture that scene in Pink Floyd's The Wall, where all the tortured children are shoved into a meat grinder to be shaped into good little boys and girls, that was the point of residential schools. Indigenous cultured child goes in, obedient white cultured child comes out. Unfortunately, it worked in many cases a lot like an actual meat grinder. More on that later. Thanks to the actions of, again, our beloved, consistently surveyed as #1 Prime Minister of all time, and no, that's not a joke, check his Wikipedia, it actually fucking says that, the residential schools were started in 1876. The operation was overseen at the time by the Catholic and Anglican churches, but it was on behalf of and alongside the Canadian government, who was the main orchestrator of all of them. The churches ran them, sure, but the Canadian government made them happen and made them illegal to not attend in many cases. Over the course of the system's more than 100-year existence, around 150,000 children were placed in residential schools nationally. Many of them were ripped straight from their parents' arms by members of the RCMP. The last school was closed down in 1996, but the impacts of it are still being felt to this day. Imagine the dumbest fucking teacher you've ever had, and then imagine them being bludgeoned with a brick. That's the cognitive ability of most of the teachers sent there. Add a few sexual predators for good measure, as well as some straight-up abusers who thought the Old Testament God's cruelty were a good frame of reference when disciplining children. Sexual and physical abuse at the hands of these barely educated teachers was rampant, with some stories recently being told of older kids making sure to be near the doors of their sleeping quarters to protect the younger kids from their abusers. Throughout the day, these kids were also forced to perform manual labor to maintain the areas. They were not paid. Somehow people will argue that slavery never existed in Canada, but that sounds a lot like slavery to me. Physical torture, such as beatings and needles through their tongues when they spoke their native language, were all commonplace. And there was even an electric chair that was used at St. Anne's Indian Residential School. Recountings have been told of getting chained to beds and beaten, getting locked in closets for days without food and water, and being beaten with physical objects, often for minor infractions, and sometimes just for the amusement of the fucking psychopaths who worked there. Clearly inspired by the church's modern tactics, many abusers moved around many of the schools so as to not suffer the consequences of their actions, a practice that has obviously stopped. Then there was the straight-up Nazi shit. Children were subjected to nutritional supplement experiments that focused on malnutrition. We know the minimum calorie count necessary to live because of experiments performed on these children who were left malnourished and given vitamin supplements to test their effectiveness in a controlled environment. Consent was not asked, and many of the children died as a result. Then there was disease. When you attended one of these schools, children were lucky if they even got to return home to their communities, sometimes only being allowed as little as 1 month to return home. As the quote by, again, the first Prime Minister of this fucking country said, Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. However, one method of getting sent home early was getting sick, as a means of preventing further spreading throughout the school itself. This meant sending a sick, infected child home where they would typically die, but not before infecting their entire village with the disease. However, outbreaks were common, and many stories have come out about children burying their classmates in mass graves nearby. Estimates for the number of school-related deaths are unknown, ranging between 3,200 to over 30,000. The reason for such a large discrepancy is because despite how record-driven our colonial British-European roots were, we did not give much of a shit when it came to recording the deaths of people we viewed as lesser. This month, we've uncovered 6 mass graves totaling 953 bodies in Canada as of June 24th using satellite imagery. These were not the first mass graves that we found, but we have been seeing an influx in media coverage for these ones. The Kamloops Indian Residential School in Alberta had a mass grave of 215 children that was found, some as young as 3 years old, with relatives claiming that they were told that their children had run away, while in reality they had been buried in the mass grave. Other mass graves were found at the Brandon Indian Residential School in Manitoba, which had 104 bodies found. The Regina Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan had 38 bodies found. The Lestock Residential School in Saskatchewan had 35 bodies found. And most recently, Cowessess Residential School in Saskatchewan found 761 bodies in a mass grave nearby the ruins of the demolished school. Gravestones and markers had once been there, but they had been bulldozed by its former members of the administration. The long-term effects of these schools are still felt to this day, and the death toll can't truly be known, as the suicide and substance abuse rates in these communities that resulted from the trauma that these schools caused is still ongoing. We found 6 grave sites recently, but there were a total of roughly 150 of the schools across Canada. It wasn't until 2008, after the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was established to uncover the truth about the schools, and the commission gathered about 7,000 statements from residential school survivors, that Stephen Harper, then Prime Minister, issued a long overdue, but rather half-assed, apology. He refused to label it cultural genocide. But that didn't matter, because in 2015, the TRC report concluded that the school system did in fact amount to cultural genocide. Reparations have occurred, but even to this day, there are lawsuits being fought by the Canadian government against survivors of these schools looking for justice. Now, it's at this point that some of you may be wondering how the fuck we got here on a new show with this name and with an anchor with this name. Well, we got here because it's Canada Day, and it's the series finale. So I wanted to do something, well, special isn't really the right word. Important? I wanted to do something important for this episode to help educate people on the absolutely fucked up history that we have here in Canada and the cunty man who helped start it all. I wouldn't have the positives of this country without his influence, but was the price worth it? Is it appropriate to make that judgment at all? Is it appropriate to revere John A. MacDonald because he was the first Prime Minister of this country, despite the long-lasting horrors he birthed alongside its merits? Should we focus only on his accomplishments and push aside the bad so as to continue on feeling the comforts that this country he was key in providing the foundation for provides to this day? Mostly to people who look like this. Simply because it's stressful to acknowledge that this comfort came at the price of other people whose crime was merely being different, and not abnormally or dangerously so, but superficially, merely differently skinned, who shared the land with us while our ancestors refused to take part in that generosity. Well, I say, fuck it. Never ignore the bad. Sir John A. MacDonald, you were the anthropomorphic manifestation of spicy diarrhea coming out of a hemorrhoid-infested asshole while sat upon a blood-soaked toilet in a gas station bathroom with no toilet paper and an angry meth head pounding on the door. The actions you echoed throughout history were debauched and depraved, and regardless of your influence on this country and its founding, no matter how much it has progressed over these many decades, an arguably lackluster claim for many, I might add, does not excuse them. So it is with that, on this last episode of Cunt News, I name you a ruinous one, whose country you helped form and its current goods should be reaped by better people, of whom there are many, given what a colossal, cruel, cutthroat, carnage-creating, catastrophe-causing, ethnic-cleansing colonial cunt that you were. So happy Canada Day, bud. I hope you're getting what you deserve. And with that, we conclude the final episode of Cunt News. Now, this was also the last episode because in hindsight, I've come to think that the name of the show was a mistake. I think it detracts from the serious nature of the subject matter that I covered today and covered in past episodes, mostly because it's hard to attract viewers to a show with such a gut punch of a title. So while I'll be retiring this show, perhaps a new show could come to fruition in the future, one that has a better name. I'm certainly open to suggestions. But to anyone who watched this, Canadian or otherwise, who was uncomfortable by the fact that I was calling the first Prime Minister of the country I live in, Sir John A. MacDonald, a cunt for the actions he did, maybe reevaluate your positions. Because if you're more offended by the word I used to describe him and not by the actions he did, a change in priorities is probably warranted. Anyway, that's our show. I'm Timothy Cockwallet, and this has been the final episode of Cunt News. Hi there. My name is Rick. I'm the guy behind the Pretentious gentleman. This was a rough video to make, both due to production time and because it was emotionally draining. Before I end it though, I wanted to name drop a few organizations that I think people should seek out. First is Legacy of Hope. They are an Indigenous charitable organization who teaches about the history of the residential school system and its ongoing effects. I will be putting links in the description for people to check it out. Another charity I wanted to mention is True North Aid. They provide humanitarian aid to Indigenous communities in the north and in remote communities across Canada. I'll also be putting links in the description. I'll also be putting a link to CanadaHelps.org. They list several Indigenous charities that you can check out. Please do your own research before donating. I'm just an opinionated guy on the internet. I'm not qualified to tell you where best to put your money, so do your due diligence beforehand. This was a hell of a production. I wrote the script last Thursday, edited it on Friday, and filmed the video content with the help of my wife on Monday. And that was followed by pretty well 2 days straight of post-production. This was also very hard because there was a lot of stuff I ended up having to leave out. There was a lot, some of which I didn't even learn about until after the camera portion was done, so I couldn't really go back to fix. I tried my best to point out corrections in the video as best I could. If I missed anything, I'm sure you'll see it in the comments section. I also cited my sources in there too. I'll try to provide a list of references I found to the best of my ability. Overall, this video was also hard because of its content. It's hard to read about and look into and come away without feeling sad and upset. So I'm right there with you if you feel that way. I'm hoping that I was able to teach people a few things about the stuff that's gone on in our country, and hopefully any new understanding can help lead to better actions in the future. Thank you everybody for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.